Now, okay, finishing up with what I wanted to say about evolution. There's an enormous amount more that I could talk about. In fact, this semester I'm teaching, the other course I'm teaching is the upper division evolution course. And some of the things that I have just briefly touched on in a lecture here would take an entire week of that to explain. There's just a lot more to know. Just a few things I want to leave you with before we move on. Evolution's not necessarily progress. And I say that because a lot of people have seen those diagrams that I showed where you have a bunch of organisms marching one after the other. And at the back of the line, you've got Bonzo the chimp. And one step ahead of him is Oog the ape man. And then comes Korg the Neanderthal. And at the head of the line is Fred the naked white guy, who is the pinnacle of the whole thing. People have this idea of evolution as being this almost like a conveyor belt, or this progress where outdated forms get replaced by newer forms, kind of the way that the iPad or the iPhone got replaced by the iPhone 2 and got replaced by the iPhone 3, and now they're up to the iPhone 8 or whatever it is. Or the way that your computer's operating system keeps getting replaced by updates. That is totally and utterly not the way that it works. I mean, measuring how complex a living thing is actually surprisingly hard to do in an objective way. Your body by any measure is more complicated than the body of a bacterium. But on the other hand, there's a hell of a lot more bacteria in the world than there are us. There are more bacteria in your large intestine than there are humans on the planet. Bacteria, the cells may seem much simpler, but they can live anywhere you can think of. There are bacteria under the Antarctic ice and a mile underground living among rocks. And we actually have a fossil record of bacteria. Those are some bacterial fossils on the left. They're revealed by taking certain rocks and using a diamond saw to grind slices through the rocks that are so thin you can shine light through them, and then looking at them under a microscope. And we have fossil bacteria, and this is a type called blue-green bacteria that's photosynthetic. I didn't say much about them, but this is the kind of bacteria you might see in a farm pond in summer, especially if a lot of cow manure is washing in. And you can compare the fossils on the left with some living blue-green bacteria on the right, and they haven't changed in any really measurable way for at least the past 2 billion years or so. They're still here. The bacteria are still running the earth. We just live on it. They haven't been replaced by anything better because they work. You could think of evolution not as survival of the fittest, but survival of whatever works well enough. Because life branches, but there's nothing in there that says old life forms get canceled by the appearance of new ones. It could happen, but there's lots of instances where it doesn't. And we have some very, very old organisms that are still around and doing perfectly fine, because evolution is not necessarily any kind of progress or betterment. I think I already ranted at you folks that evolution is not survival of the meanest. You hear the phrase survival of the fittest, and I hate that phrase, partly because Darwin didn't actually say it, but also because when you say survival of the fittest, people think you're talking about survival of the most ruthless and savage or the most backstabbing. Now, fitness does have a certain technical meaning in mathematical models of evolution, but it doesn't mean what you think it does. It does not necessarily, in fact, very often, it does not mean, this savage lion tearing apart a helpless gazelle or anything like that. We'll see some spectacular cases of this late in the course. I'm not going to get to it just yet, but very often, like unbelievably frequently, the organisms that do best, that have the best odds of surviving and reproducing, are not the killers, they're the cooperative ones. There's nothing anywhere in evolutionary biology that says you have to be a bastard to get ahead. And there's lots of cases where organisms work out ways to cooperate and even, mutually assist each other. And that does not go against evolutionary biology at all. Nothing in there says anything about, being ruthless is the only way to survive. That whole law of the jungle thing is mostly BS. One thing I haven't talked about is the ultimate origin of life. We talked about the features of life, which I hope you know for the exam. Things like homeostasis, cells, CHNOPS, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, right? Molecules of 4 basic types, DNA, things like that. We've talked about all of that. I haven't said anything about how it got here. And the reason for that is going into that requires a deeper dive into chemistry and physics than we've got time for in a class like this. You could understand it, but it would take longer than we've got. Now, the question of how life itself originated from matter that was not alive roughly 4 billion years ago next Thursday, that's called abiogenesis, life coming from something non-living. How the heck that happened is an amazingly complicated question. We don't have a complete solution. We have some really fascinating leads. We know in outline how parts of the process happened. We don't really have a full understanding, but we've gotten a lot closer. And I wish I had more time for this, but we could talk about that for an entire semester and not cover anything else. And we've got other things we have to cover in here. I will mention that you might have heard that we've just landed a rover on Mars, Perseverance. One of the things that rover is supposed to do is look for signs that life once existed on Mars. We don't really know how easy it is for life to emerge on a planet. We know it's happened once, but whether that's the only time it ever did or whether it might happen anytime you have the right conditions, we don't know, but we're going to learn something about that from what Perseverance brings back, or at least I hope we do. But evolutionary biology primarily works with what happens after life got there. If we found out that life on Earth appeared because a bunch of aliens landed on Earth and had a picnic and forgot to take their discarded picnic wrappers home when they blasted off, and those wrappers contained the first bacteria, fine, so be it. What I work on as an evolutionary biologist is what happened after self-replicating life forms appeared. Abiogenesis is really, really cool stuff. It doesn't make that much difference to about 99.99% of what we do. What you looking for, sweetie? Sorry, I do not know where I have not used them recently. Yeah. You had them yesterday coming home.
Sorry.
Okay. No, quite all right. Okay. All right. I tell people that I teach evolution in the state of Arkansas, and they all laugh because Arkansas has a reputation of being a place where there are a lot of people who oppose evolution on the grounds of religion. I have not said anything about that, mostly because it's none of my business. Some of you, maybe many of you, have religious convictions, and I'm not here to argue against those or try to make you abandon them or anything like that. If you have a faith that gives you strength and courage and makes you a better person than you would be without it, then there is not a thing in the world wrong with holding on to that. That's not what I'm here for. That's not what I want to do. And that's not what the state pays me to do. All right. Sorry, my wife is trying to find her keys at the. No, it's okay. It's okay. I don't know where they are. Me either. A little disturbing. Right. Anyway, about that whole evolution versus religion thing. There's a long tradition of what's called theistic evolution. And this is the position basically of the Roman Catholic Church, the mainstream Protestant denominations, um, uh, most traditions in Judaism, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this interprets biological evolution as being real, and it happened the way the scientists say that it does, but it's ultimately the way that God accomplishes the divine purpose, that evolution's the tool that God is able to use. Now, it is not my place to say whether that's right or wrong. That's what my mother told me when I was 7 and starting to ask questions about dinosaurs and things like that. You don't have to accept it. You are certainly free to think what you want to or find your own way about this. But many Christian denominations and traditions don't have a particular problem with biological evolution. Someone once said that they're not concerned with the ages of rocks, they're concerned with the rock of ages. But that was an attempt at a joke. So I've never asked what students believe because it's completely none of my business. I'm not going to require you to make any kind of statement of belief in evolution because belief is not really what science is about. You know, we don't go around in our science classes making altar calls to Darwin or to the atomic theory of matter or, you know, the theory of chemical reactions or anything like that. I don't believe in evolution. I accept that what we've got, what we know about it, is the best explanation anybody's come up with for how all of the life that we see got here. I and thousands of scientists like me have done work to try to put parts of it to the test. And every so often, cherished ideas in evolutionary biology get torn down and have to be replaced by better ideas because that's how science works. But ultimately, you are the ones who have to figure out how this all fits together. This is partly why we make you take classes in things like philosophy in addition to your classes in science. I don't particularly care about your own belief. What you have to do is understand how evolution works to the best of your ability to learn and my ability to teach in the time and with the resources that we've got. And I'll leave the last word on that subject to Charles Darwin himself, who, as an old man, wrote a letter discussing this, saying that a man who wishes to form a judgment on this subject must weigh the evidence for himself, and he ought not to be influenced by being told that a considerable number of scientific men can reconcile the results of science with revealed or natural religion, whilst others cannot do so. There are scientists who have been very outspoken atheists. The guy I'm thinking of is Richard Dawkins. who's written some great books on evolution and also wrote a book called The God Delusion. There are other very good scientists who are religious in one way or another. You figure it out.
That's the only way it really works is
Yeah.
if you do it yourself.
Yeah, my wife has just said the only way it really works is if you do it yourself. All right. Okay. That's what does Paul say about spiritual milk for babies? But as you grow up, you have to have meat.
Mhm.
Well, maybe for some of you, this whole evolution thing is a rather tough piece of gristle that you've got to chew. But ultimately, that's how you mature. Right. So I'm going to quit preaching and move on to something else. And that last slide was the last thing I could possibly test you on. What follows from here on out is going to be covered on the second exam. So, I mean, you still do have to know it. I will test you on it eventually. But you won't see it on Monday. So Chuck D publishes his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. By about 1870, just about every scientist who had studied agreed that some form of natural process, some form of natural process that scientists could study acting over long periods of time was responsible for all of the cats and bats and things like that. All of the living things that we see, all the plants and animals and protists and slime molds and all of that. As Darwin put it, with such moderate abilities as I possess, it is truly surprising that I should have influenced to a considerable extent the belief of scientific men on some important points. But, wait, hold it. Darwin made the strongest case that anybody had ever made that some kind of natural process that could be studied ultimately produced all of life from some very, very distant common ancestor an awfully long time ago. But Darwin didn't just do that. He didn't just make a case that evolution had happened. He proposed the theory of natural selection, and that was actually not widely accepted during Darwin's own lifetime. People had other hypotheses for what might be causing evolutionary change in life over time. And there were several objections, but the big one was that natural selection, for it to work, you have to have variation and you have to have heredity, right? Individuals in a population vary. They're all different from each other. And at least some of that variation is inherited, is passed on. You resemble your parents. Your pets resemble their pet parents, their mommy cat or mommy dog or whatever it might have been, or mommy goose or mommy goldfish or mommy gecko, whatever you've got. So we know that living things vary, and we know that some of those traits that can vary get passed on, but Darwin had no idea how this worked. And to be fair, neither did anybody else. This was a very big black box. Remember that first lab that you did where you have this sealed cardboard box and you have to figure out what's inside? Well, we're dealing now with a very, very large black box right now. The question of how variation and heredity happens. They do happen. You can see it in your own family. But how do they happen? What makes them happen? Why should organisms vary in the first place? And if they vary, how can they pass that variation on? Oof. Well, the first guy who made real progress in rattling that black box lived at the same time that Darwin did, but they never met. And what he did wasn't really appreciated until after he himself was dead. He lived here. He was born with the name Johann, But he took his vows as a Benedictine monk in the Roman Catholic Church here at the Abbey of St. Thomas in the city of Brno, and that is spelled correctly. Czech is not really enthusiastic about using vowels.
No vowels.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So, yeah, so that is the name of the city, Brno, in what's now the Czech Republic. And in 1843, Brother Johann took his vows as a monk right here and spent his life living here. He took a new name as part of his vows, and nobody remembers that his name was Johann. He's better known as Brother Gregor. Brother Gregor did get permission to study at the University of Vienna in Austria, and he came back to Brno to teach in the school because then, as now, the Roman Catholic Church runs an awful lot of schools. And he became a teacher, a good one by all accounts. In his spare time, he did some science experiments. He was an amateur. He wasn't a professional scientist, but he had a good mind. He was interested in a lot of problems. He'd grown up on a farm outside the town of Olomouc, and maybe it was growing up on a farm, but he got interested in the problem of heredity. How do living things make their offspring look like them? The story goes that Brother Gregor wanted to do some experiments with crossbreeding rabbits of different shapes and sizes and colors. Cross a black bunny and a white bunny, and what do you get? The story is that the chief monk, the abbot of the monastery, told him he couldn't do that because monks are supposed to take vows of celibacy, meaning they're not supposed to think about sex. And rabbits, of course, breed like rabbits. But he did get the abbot's permission to do some experiments using peas, common garden peas, Pisum sativum, the ones that you eat, or maybe you don't eat if you don't like them. And I guess the abbot figured that this would be safe because peas are not very sexy. And it turned out they were ideal for his experiments. First of all, because they're easy to grow. Second, because you can eat them when you're finished with them. They don't take up huge amounts of space. They grow fairly quickly. They grow in many conditions. You don't have to have the temperature exactly right. And what's more, they come in a large number of different varieties. The peas that I've planted in my own garden have always had white flowers, and at the upper right, that's the flower of a pea. But there are other varieties of pea that have purple flowers, which you see at the upper left. Some varieties of pea, the pod is very smooth. We say it's inflated because it looks like it's been blown up from the inside like a long balloon. Other varieties of peas, the pod fits much more tightly over the seeds, and you have what's called a constricted pod. There are pea varieties that are tall and pea varieties that are dwarf. There are pea varieties that have yellow peas and pea varieties that have green peas. There are pea varieties that have their flowers at the tips of stems, and pea varieties that have flowers on the sides of stems, and so on. There's lots of different pea varieties. And by the way, you'll see this term again. We would now say that peas are a good model system. A model system is a living thing, an organism, a species that happens to be very convenient for studying some bigger problem. You could study heredity with anything. I mean, you could study heredity in elephants. The problem is that it takes elephant pregnancy last 18 months. So it would take a very long time to get results from crossbreeding elephants. Elephants also eat a lot and they could kill you. Male elephants in the breeding season go into this testosterone crazed state that makes them exceptionally dangerous. Peas, on the other hand, don't have any of those disadvantages. You can grow a lot of them quickly and easily and get results in a decent amount of time, and peas won't kill you unless you happen to be allergic to them. So I'm going to say a lot today and Wednesday, I guess, about peas, but again, don't memorize details about pea plants. Peas just happen to be a very good system for working out how heredity works, and the rules that apply to peas turn out to apply to you as well. In fact, they apply to just about every animal, plant, protist, and fungus. Just about every eukaryote with some modification. Heredity follows the rules that Mendel worked out on pea plants. The same rules we're going to talk about that determine whether a pea plant inherits purple or white flowers also determine whether a baby inherits muscular dystrophy, for example, or cystic fibrosis, or even an elevated risk of breast cancer. So don't focus on the peas, focus on the rules. But peas are a very good organism to do experiments on to work those rules out. So we say that peas are a good model system. The other thing that makes peas a good model system is that they cover their sex organs. This is a pea flower, and the fancy name for this is a papilionaceous flower, which means it looks like a butterfly because you have these, petals kind of spreading out that look like wings there in the back. But flowers are not there just to look pretty. Flowers contain the sex organs of a flowering plant. When you see a beautiful bouquet, it's basically a bunch of sex organs. Maybe you pinned a bunch of sex organs on your date's prom dress or tuxedo or something like that. Yeah, the world looks different when you're a biologist. There's sex organs waving in the breeze everywhere. Pea flowers are relatively rare because they cover those up. In the center of that flower, there's what looks like a little cone made of rolled up petals. That contains the sex organs. And the fact that the sex organs are wrapped up together, and the fact that a pea has both male and female sex organs in the same flower, means that pea flowers normally self-fertilize. This is what one looks like. Up at the top, you've got a diagram of a pea-type flower. This is also a type of flower you would see in beans, in clover. What you think of as a clover flower is actually a cluster of little flowers like this. Wisteria is an ornamental that you might know that has flowers that look like this. And in that central little rolled up cone of flowers labeled the keel, when you cut that keel in the middle, you can see down at the bottom, there's a diagram. At the base, there is an ovary, and the ovary contains egg cells. And attached to the ovary, there's a long structure called a pistil. And at the tip of the pistil, there's a sticky pad called the stigma. That's the female sex organs. Surrounding the ovary, you've got structures called stamens, and at the tip of each stamen, there is something called an anther, and anthers make pollen. Pollen is not exactly sperm, but you can think of it as being similar to sperm. When the anthers make pollen, the pollen gets onto the stigma, and the pollen contains sperm. So the sperm leaves the pollen grain and pushes its way down that stigma through a little tube that it makes, and eventually reaches the egg and fertilizes it. So yeah, when there's lots of pollen in the air, it's basically plant sperm. In about a month, you're going to be dusting an awful lot of oak tree sperm off your cars. That usually happens around here. Plant sperm makes you sneeze at certain times of the year. I'm sure you're really, really overjoyed to know that. Anyway, most flowers, and that includes oaks. Oaks don't have pretty flowers. They don't have petals, but they do have ovaries and stigmas and stamens and all of that. In most flowers, the pollen leaves the flower and travels to another flower to fertilize its eggs. Sometimes that's done by wind, as in the case of the oak trees around here in March and April. All that yellow dust that builds up on your car, that's pollen being blown by the wind. Sometimes there are animals like bees or even hummingbirds that carry it. There's lots of different ways that flowers get their pollen from one to the other. Pea plants don't bother with any of that. The male sex organs of each flower produce pollen grains that fertilize the female sex organs of the same flower. So if you're angry at a pea flower, don't tell it to go F itself, because the pea flower will just say, yeah, so that's what I always do. That's the way it's done for peas. Anyway, probably more than you wanted to know about plant sex, but Brother Gregor, or to give him his full name, Brother Gregor Mendel, found that he could cut those flowers open with a very sharp scalpel, use a paintbrush to pick up pollen from one flower, transfer that pollen to another flower, and then he could seal the flowers back up with a little bit of sealing wax. The reason that matters, and the reason I've dragged you through all of this technical discussion of how flowers have sex, is that what Brother Gregor was able to do was very carefully control what plant reproduces with what plant. He was able to control crossbreeding between his plants very carefully. So he was able to say with certainty, we know that this plant over here got its pollen from this plant over here. With most flowers, it's very hard to be that sure, because flowers might get pollen from anywhere. But Gregor could do these very carefully controlled crossbreeding experiments. So he could crossbreed a pea plant with purple flowers and a pea plant with white flowers, or a tall pea plant and a dwarf pea plant, or a pea plant with yellow pods and a pea plant with green pods, and see what he got. He could do experiments very well controlled with very few variables. So he selected varieties of pea that bred true. And what that means is, if you leave them alone, let them self-fertilize, and just plant seeds from each pea plant to produce the next generation, they would produce more of the same variety for as long as you cared to grow them. If you just grow a purple flowering pea plant and you save seeds and you plant them, you'll get more purple flowered pea plants, and so on, for as many generations as you feel like being in the pea business. But Mendel wanted to know what happened if you crossbred two different varieties. If you cross a purple flowered pea and a white flowered pea, would you get a pink flowered pea? Would you get a purple white spotted flower pea, like a purple Dalmatian pea? Would you get a plant with some purple flowers and some white? Would they all be purple? Would they all be white? What would you get? He ended up raising 29,000 pea plants over the course of 8 years. This happens to be the greenhouse on the grounds of the monastery where he grew his peas. The original was destroyed, although I think they've built a replica of it because that monastery is now a tourist attraction in Brno. We don't have time to look at all 29,000 pea plants, but let's look at one of his crosses. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to do this really quickly, but we will pick it up on Wednesday. When he crossed a purple flowered pea with a white flowered pea, what he got was all of the offspring had purple flowers. There were no exceptions. So the white color did not appear in the next generation. Huh. That might have been that, but when he took two of the next generation of peas, the hybrid generation, hybrid refers to crossbreeding between different varieties. When he took those and crossbred them, he ended up with white flowered peas appearing in the second generation. So the first cross he did, all he got was purple flowered peas. But when he crossbred peas from that generation, the next generation, white flowers showed up again. The white flower color had skipped a generation. I'll bring this up again, but there's a standard scheme for keeping track of the generations. The P generation, the letter P generation, is the first cross that he did. We call that the parental generation. The seeds that he got from that cross grew into the F1 generation. F stands for filial, which is Latin for sons and daughters. So filial means offspring. And then the next generation after that was the F2 generation. One of my colleagues had a baby a couple of years ago, and I kept asking, how was your F1? Little biology joke right there. And then if he'd taken some of the F2 plants and crossbred them, they would be the F3s, F4, however many times you want to keep it going. So he concluded there were some sort of little particles in the P cells that made them look the way they do. That heredity was not like mixing paint because you didn't get pink peas. You got either purple or white peas, but you never got anything in between. The trait of purple flower color is, we say it's dominant because in a cross, the purple somehow covers up the white, but white can be passed on. White pea flower color could skip a generation. White little particles can be covered, but they can show up later on. We now say that purple flower color is dominant and white is recessive. That doesn't mean, by the way, that purple is superior. It doesn't mean that purple is good or white is somehow not good or not right. It just means that if you cross a purple and a white pea plant, purple covers up white, but white can appear later on. And I'm low on time, and I may not have explained that as fully as I'd like to, but we will pick this up on Wednesday after the exam, and I'll recap that and hopefully do a more complete job. And I will stop the recording now.